You've clearly got lots of experience working on the contract services side of things. What would be the best way to align their strategic goals, their economic incentives in a way that they're going to be aligned with you and go above and beyond what the contract says?
I think when it comes to economic incentives, I just think it's underappreciated. If anybody's kind of a reader of Freakonomics, it's just sort of very interesting that human beings, they respond to economic incentives,
Mm,
and to ignore that, we ignore that at our own peril. And so I think it may seem a little clinical, meaning unemotional or draconian, but I think um, putting incentive contracts in place for timely performance, and having those incentives also be aligned with not just on-time delivery, whether you're talking about development or commercialization, but also with respect to quality. On-time delivery and quality are table stakes for all of us in this business. You have to deliver those things. Whether you're in-house and have your own team, or you're working with a service provider, and then having an incentive that's linked to, again, delivering that baseline performance, but then also on-time delivery or early delivery. Those types of contracts, and I've been inside at service providers, and when we've had those contracts, they're talked about differently.
mm,
And I think that's exactly what a buyer wants. And I think the other thing that I think is really important is to, again, using a term that's been around for a while, is having the right operating mechanisms, or social operating mechanisms, as was talked about in the book Execution. It's a great book, and there's a lot of great lessons in there still to be kind of relearned, from Ram Charan and Larry Bossidy. But having operating mechanisms in place, social operating mechanisms in place that allow for uh, open and honest and real, transparent, discussion about what's happening and why, and then making sure that there's enough trust that in between the meetings where you having your operating mechanisms, that when the inevitable challenges pop up, that the communication is free and easy, right? It's not
mm.
about being right. It's not about being wrong. It's about being focused on the task at hand and delivering. And I think those things are really important. And I think not enough attention is paid to making sure that the relationship is strong enough that kind of in between meetings, that the communication is robust and it's good and it's quick, and that when something doesn't go the way that it should, at your service provider, that they call you and they let you know, and vice versa. When you reach out to them, that they get back to you right away and say, "Listen, I don't have an answer for you right now, but I'll get back to you tomorrow."
Above and beyond, I guess, putting into the contract milestones around hitting particular KPIs. Going beyond that, are there any different approaches or models that you'd recommend so that both sides become equally invested in a project?
Yeah, I think sometimes there can be some benefits to how liability is distributed and shared between the parties. Sometimes you know it can be difficult to kind of find a good balance there, but I think um, when you do find a balance point, between both parties, I think what you find is that people are willing to move faster. I mean, not be reckless, of course, but
Mm,
but to move faster, and potentially take some risk on their own. Um, and the reason why I've raised that is typically it's usually a zero-sum game, right? The provider doesn't want to take any risk, and um, and the buyer doesn't want to take any risk. But I think, again, once you've got a core um, relationship around trust, and you've got the right metrics in place, I think um, having, again, it's a different form of a financial incentive, right? Where there's some room for each party to kind of operate and not have to kind of fear extreme economic repercussions. I think I've seen, again, work really well.
Mhm.
I think having a very clear escalation, process, if you will, or information sharing process, for reporting and any kind of resolution, I think is also just an excellent practice. I often find that in contracts, there's quite a bit of attention paid to, the scope of work and what has to be delivered, but a lot less attention paid to the practicalities of, well, what if we don't agree? What if we don't understand each other? How are we going to actually work through that?
Mm.
Um, that's part of what I think can create an open and transparent relationship about what's happening, and why. And then I think maybe the last thing I would say is, having some open conversations around um, what does anybody expect when it comes to change orders, right? I mean, inevitably things happen, right?
Mhm.
And I think that depending on what each party is kind of thinking about, I've also seen it work quite well that there's some language in these contracts around change orders, right? There's some scoping that's put in for, let's say, levels of complexity as it relates to some risk management work that's been done before the project starts. And so it's just kind of clear that if this issue pops up, it falls into tier A of change orders, and here's the
Mm.
people who need to be involved in that discussion. And then there's obviously higher levels. It's a bit like a kind of a grant of authority matrix, right? That you'd see, with respect to approvals inside of most companies these days. So those are some of the, I'll say, better or best practices I've seen in contracting. They take some more time, obviously, Luke, but when you put that time in the beginning, it also gives you a lot of really interesting clues and texture around how does your partner do business.
Yeah.
And if they're not willing to have those conversations, or they get rigid, look, you may still decide you want to work with that company because they have the skills and experience that you need. But those are signals nonetheless that need to be kind of kept in mind, right? That's how they're going to be moving forward.